Thank you, Mr. President. I rise this morning to speak in favor of Amendment number 1107. But first, let me say that I know how hard Chairman Levin and Ranking Member McCain have worked to craft a Defense Authorization Act that provides our armed forces with the equipment, the services, and the support that they need to keep us safe. And I want to thank also my colleagues from the Armed Services Committee, a number of whom I see here on the floor this morning, for their diligence and their dedication to this important work. With that, let me turn to the amendment itself. And I wanted to start, Mr. President, by thanking the co-sponsors of the amendment. And they include the chairwoman of the Intelligence Committee, Senator Feinstein, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Leahy, and our colleague, Senator Webb, former Secretary of the Navy, and someone I think we all respect when it comes to national security issues. And I also want to point out that this amendment is a bipartisan amendment. Senator Rand Paul joined as a co-sponsor this morning and gave, I think, a very compelling floor speech just a few minutes ago. Senators Wyden and Durbin have also recently co-sponsored the amendment. I want to recognize their leadership as well. So, Mr. President, again, let me turn to the amendment itself. A growing number of our colleagues have strong concerns about the detainee provisions in this bill. And at the heart of our concerns is the concern that we've not taken enough time to listen to our counterterrorism community and have not heeded the warnings of the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Director of the FBI, who all oppose these provisions. Equally concerning, Mr. President, we have not had a single hearing on these detainee matters to fully understand the implications of our actions. My amendment would take out these provisions and give us in the Congress an opportunity to take a hard look at the needs of our counterterrorism professionals and respond in a measured way that reflects the input of those who are actually fighting our enemies. Specifically, the amendment would require that our defense, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies report to Congress with recommendations for any additional authorities or flexibility that they need in order to detain and prosecute terrorists. My amendment would then ask for hearings to be held so we can fully understand the views of relevant national security experts. In other words, Mr. President, I'm saying let's ask our dedicated men and women who are actually fighting to protect Americans what they actually need to keep us safe. This is a marked departure, in my opinion, from the current language in the bill, which was developed without hearings and seeks to make changes to the law that our national security professionals do not want and even oppose, as I pointed out. Like other challenging issues we face here in the United States Senate, we should identify the problem, hold hearings, gather input from those affected by our actions, and then seek to find the most prudent solution. Instead, we have language in the bill, while well-intended, of that there's no doubt, that was developed behind closed doors and is being moved rather quickly through our Congress. The Secretary of Defense is warning us that we may be making mistakes that will hurt our capacity to fight terrorism at home and abroad. The Director of National Intelligence is telling us that this language will create more problems than it solves. The Director of the FBI is telling Congress that these provisions will erect hurdles that make it more difficult for our law enforcement officials to collaborate in their effort to protect American citizens. And the President's national security staff is recommending a veto of the entire defense authorization bill if these provisions remain in the bill. Now, with this full spectrum of highly respected officials and top counterterrorism professionals warning Congress not to pass these provisions, we are being asked to reject their advice and pass them anyway, again without any hearings or further deliberation. I don't know what others think, but I don't think this is what the people in Colorado expect us to do, and it's not how I envision the Senate operating. The provisions would dramatically change broad counterterrorism efforts by requiring law enforcement officials to step aside and ask the Department of Defense to take on a new role they are not fully equipped for and do not want. And by taking away the flexible decision-making capacity of our national security team, by forcing the military to now act as police, judge, and jailer, these provisions could effectively rebuild walls between our military, law enforcement, and intelligence communities that we've spent a decade tearing down. The provisions that are in the bill, to me and many others, appear to require that the DoD shift significant resources away from their mission to serve on all fronts all over the world. Now, this has real consequences, Mr. President, because we have limited resources and limited manpower. And again, I just want to say I don't think we'd lose anything by taking a little bit more time to discuss and debate these provisions. But we could do real harm to our national security efforts by allowing this language to pass, and that's exactly what our highest-ranking national security officers are warning us against doing. Mr. President, you'll note I'm speaking in the broadest terms here, but I did want to speak to one particular area of concern, just to give viewers and my colleagues a sense of what we face. The provisions authorize the indefinite military detention of American citizens who are suspected of involvement in terrorism, even those captured here in our own country, in the United States, which I think should concern each and every one of us. These provisions could well represent an unprecedented threat to our constitutional liberties. So let me explain why I think that's the case. Look, I agree that if an American citizen joins al-Qaeda and takes up arms against the United States, that person should be subject to the same process as any other enemy combatant. But what is not clear is what we do with someone arrested in his home because of suspected terrorist ties. These detainee provisions would authorize that person's indefinite detention, but it misses a critical point. How do we know, Mr. President, how do we know that a citizen has committed these crimes unless they are tried and convicted? Do we really want to open the door to domestic military police powers and possibly deny U.S. citizens their due process rights? If we do, I think that's at least something that's very worthy of a hearing, and the American people should be made aware of the changes that would be forthcoming in the way we approach civil liberties. But since our counterterrorism officials are telling us these provisions are a mistake, I'm not willing to both potentially limit our fight against terrorism and simultaneously threaten the constitutional freedoms Americans hold dear. As I begin my remarks, Mr. President, I hope I projected my belief that we have a solemn obligation to pass the National Defense Authorization Act. But we also have a solemn obligation to make sure that those who are fighting the war on terror have the best, most flexible, most powerful tools possible. To be perfectly frank, I'm worried that these provisions will disrupt our ability to combat terrorism and inject untested legal ambiguity into our military's operations and detention practices. We will hear some of our colleagues tell you not to worry because the detainee provisions are designed not to hurt our counterterrorism efforts. We all know that the best laid plans can have unintended consequences. And while I'm sure the drafters of this language intended the provisions to be interpreted in a way that does not cause problems, the counterterrorism community disagrees and has outlined some very serious real-world concerns. Stating in the language that there will not be any adverse effects on national security doesn't make it so. These are not just words in a proposed law, and those that will be chartered to actually carry out these provisions are urging us to reject them. Shouldn't we listen to their serious concerns? Shouldn't we think twice about passing these provisions? I've not received a single phone call from a counterterrorism expert, a professional in the field, or a senior military official urging us to pass these provisions. We have heard a wide range of concerns expressed about the unintended consequences of enacting these detainee provisions, but not a single voice outside of Congress telling us that this will help us protect Americans or make us safer. And Mr. President, in addition to our national security team who are urging us to oppose these provisions, Other important voices are also asking us to stop, slow down, and consider them more thoroughly. The American Bar Association, the ACLU, the International Red Cross, the American Legion, and a number of other groups have also expressed a wide range of serious concerns. And again, I want to underline, although the language was crafted with the best of intentions, there are simply too many questions about the unintended consequences of these provisions to allow them to move forward without further input from national security experts through holding hearings and engaging in further debate. Mr. President, I'm privileged to be a member of the Armed Services Committee. I'm truly honored. And as I've implied, and I want to be explicit, I understand the importance of this bill. I understand what it does for our military, which is why in sum, what I'm going to propose with my amendment is that we pass the NDAA without these troubling provisions, but with a mechanism by which we can consider in depth what's proposed and at a later date include any applicable changes in the law. It's not only the right thing to do policy-wise, it may very well protect this bill from a veto. The clearest path towards giving our men and women in uniform the tools they need is to pass this amendment and then send a clean National Defense Authorization Act to the President. In the Statement of Administration Policy, the President says the following, and I should again mention in the Statement of Administration Policy, there's a recommendation that the President veto the bill. Quote, we've spent 10 years since September 11, 2001, breaking down the walls between intelligence, military, and law enforcement professionals. Congress should not now rebuild those walls and unnecessarily make the job of preventing terrorist attacks more difficult. These are striking words. They should give us all pause as we face what seems to be a bit of a rush to pass these untested and legally controversial restrictions on our ability to prosecute terrorists. So, Mr. President, I want to begin to close and in so doing urge my colleagues to think about the precedent we would set by passing these provisions. We are being told that these detainee provisions are so important that we must pass them right away without a hearing or further deliberation. However, the Secretary of Defense at the same time, along with the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of the FBI, are all urging us to reject the provisions and take a closer look. Do we really want to neglect the advice of our trusted national security professionals? I can't think of another instance where we would rebuff those chartered with keeping us safe. If we in the Congress want to constrain the military and give our service members new responsibilities, as these provisions would do, I believe we ought to listen to what the Secretary of Defense has had to say about it. Secretary Panetta is strongly opposed to these changes. And I think we all know that before he held the job he has now, Secretary of Defense, Mr. Panetta was the director of the CIA. He very well knows the threats facing our country, and he knows we cannot afford to make any mistakes when it comes to keeping our citizens right. We have to be right every time. The bad guys only have to be right once. So this is the debate we need to have. It's a healthy debate, but we ought to be armed with all of the facts and expertise before we move forward. The least we can do is to take our time, be diligent, and hear from those who will be affected by these new significant changes in how we interrogate and prosecute terrorists. So, as I've said before, it concerns me that we would tell our national security leadership, a bipartisan national security leadership, by the way, that we would not listen to them and that Congress knows better than they do. It doesn't strike me that that's the best way to secure and protect the American people. That's why I filed amendment number 1107. I think my amendment is a common sense alternative that will protect our constitutional principles and beliefs while continuing to keep our nation safe. The amendment has a clear aim, which is to ensure we follow a thorough process and hear all views before rushing forward with new laws that could be harmful to our national security. It's straightforward, it's common sense, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment.